Good evening, friends and members. This evening, we have a chance to learn about one of America's most important collections of Japanese woodblock prints, the Worcester Art Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts. Assistant Curator of Asian Art at the museum, Dr. Fiona Collins-Rosedahl, joins us today to discuss her current exhibition, Pictures of a Changing Japan, the Evolution of Shin Hanga, that runs at the museum until June 29th. She specializes in Japanese prints, as we can imagine, and oversees exhibitions and research related to the museum's Japanese art collection, including her recent exhibition, The Floating World Japanese Prints from the John Chandler Bancroft Collection in 2022. She holds a master's degree in Japanese studies from SOAS, the University of London, and teaches art history at Clark University. Some of her recent projects include a traveling exhibition of ukiyo-e at the Blanton Museum of Art and papers focusing on her museum's seminal collection of Japanese woodblock prints. Most importantly, she's working on a catalog of highlights of the collection that will be published in 2025. We'll have a chance to glimpse at the Worcester Art Museum's key role in promoting Shin Hanga through its exhibitions and programming that, in our speaker's words, help establish the genre internationally. Now, welcome, Fiona.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so excited to introduce you to my new exhibition, The Reflections of a Changing Japan, The Evolution of Shin Hanga. Before I get kind of into the meat of what inspired me to do this exhibition, I'd like to introduce you a little bit to the Worcester Art Museum collection and contextualize this project within previous projects run by the museum over the last 125 years. But before even doing that, I just wanted to introduce what is Japanese woodblock printmaking to audience members who maybe are less familiar. What makes them distinct, when were they introduced, etc. So Japanese printmaking as a process was printmaking as a process was introduced to Japan as early as the 7th century AD, and was typically used for the reproduction of Buddhist prayers. However, when one thinks of woodblock prints, one typically thinks of those that were developed during the Edo period, which was 1603 to 1868. It was a time of relative peace in Japan, in which they enacted strict isolationist movements. And so within this flourishing peace and flourishing economy, so also flourished the frivolous activities of merchants, artisans, samurai in city centers. And so the prints that depict that culture of celebration are called ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, which is a term that kind of captures the zeitgeist of that time period. With the advent of ukiyo-e, the technical nature of woodblock prints expanded, and they introduced multi-colored woodblock prints, or nishiki-e, which also translates to brocade prints. And so you can really see through this diagram how they were made. They were essentially jigsawed together, as I like to say, with each cherry block containing a different, having a different carved element of the print onto it. And so as you printed the different elements on, it created the final image, in this case, the iconic Great Wave off of Kanagawa by Katsushika Hokusai. So our collection at the Worcester Art Museum is actually quite a seminal one, and has over 3,000 ukiyo-e prints, most of which belong to the John Chandler Bancroft collection. For some context, John Chandler Bancroft was a Boston-based businessman who was born in Worcester, who initially was exposed to Japanese prints as early as the 1850s, when he was traveling through France and other European countries pursuing his artistic dreams. He was particularly interested in landscape painting in the Barbizon School. So there's little record really to say exactly how that influenced him. Really, we know that the majority of his prints were collected in the 1860s while he was in Newport, Rhode Island. So he, as well as one of his dear friends, John Lafarge, the famed American painter and glassmaker, were both laid low during the Civil War because they were deemed unfit for military service. And so with time on their hands and spending time in Newport, they started to collect Japanese prints, primarily through A.A. Lowe, who was a dealer in New York City at the time. This is quite early for context. When one thinks of Japanimania or this kind of fascination with woodblock prints, maybe in connection, for example, to the Impressionists or Vincent van Gogh, it's usually much later in the 1870s or 1880s. So because of this early time, they tend to be in quite good condition in our collection. And in 1901, he actually donated all 3,000 of them to the Worcester Art Museum. Founding the John Chandler Bancroft collection. So it is actually the earliest public collection of Japanese prints in the country. Often there are other collections in the country that were, for example, promised Japanese prints before this time point, such as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston or the National Gallery. But those were donated after the death of, for example, Bigelow in 1911 in the case of the Museum of Fine Arts. And so 1901 puts Worcester Art Museum as the earliest public collection of Japanese prints in the United States at the time. Its strengths are ukiyo-e, as I mentioned, but particularly hand-colored early prints before the advent of multi-block color printing, as well as 19th century landscapes, which is fitting with his interest, Bancroft's interest in landscape painting. An interesting element of his collecting practice was that he was particularly interested in modern developments in optometry. He actually later went to Harvard to study science, the science of sight, and so thought that Japanese prints, particularly 19th century landscape artists like Hokusai, reflected intuitively the difference between the color of light and surface color. This is all reflected through his correspondence with his father, who is actually George Bancroft, the author of The History of the United States, in the Cornell archives. So since then, there have been several collecting waves, I should say, at the Worcester Art Museum. In the 1910s through 50s, but particularly earlier in the 20th century, it was to flesh out the elements of our ukiyo-e collection that Bancroft didn't have, essentially. So, for example, even though we had a great wave, the one that was collected in 1918 was a slightly better color impression. So it was fleshing it out in that particular sense. The other objective they had was to add more actor prints. So ones such as this Shadaku print were purchased by discretionary funds in the early decades of the 20th century as well. This was the major point of interest, and it was the subject of a lot of our programming at that time. Then in the 1950s to 1990s, there was more of an interest in collaborating with contemporary working living artists. Some of them worked in more sort of traditional, naturalistic, figurative forms, and some of them were more abstracted. And so this was primarily initiated by curators such as Alice Munt, who collaborated with local institutions to bring artists to the Worcester Art Museum, or she would travel to local cities to go and see them, particularly in New York, and she met many of them through the Japan Society. Another major wave was in the early 2000s with the acquisition of quite a few Yoshitoshi prints in Meiji period, which is the late 1868 to 1912. So the post-Edo period prints at the time, we also had very few of those. And so at that point, by the time we get to the early 2000s, we have quite a well fleshed out collection from the advent of multi-block printmaking in the early Edo period through the present. However, even though many of these were represented in our programming at the time, we have had many exhibitions on the ukiyo-e collection, some of which were curated by me, And we have had several that are on modern and abstracted prints and contemporary artists. We also had a Yoshitoshi show about 10 years ago. There's one type of print that really hasn't gotten any attention, one genre of print, I should say, from the early 20th century that I discovered we had several dozen of these kinds of prints, and I really wanted to bring it to the attention of our visitors, as well as just kind of bring attention to the impact and legacy of that movement, which is Shin Hanga. So this is the first exhibition on this topic that we've done at the museum, which makes it quite significant. It's quite an opportunity to bring attention to these wonderful prints. 30 of the prints have never been on display before. And then we also got we were lucky to have 3 loans from a local collector who had been collecting as early as the 1950s, and she's local to Boston, and she had some pretty wonderful prints. So I'll point them out when they come along. I did want to bring attention at this point, just a little bit of background to this beautiful color. So this print, and can just clarify, this print is actually not, this Hasui print is not in the exhibition itself. But it's a very common green hue, which it's hard to find a name for it, but this green hue is very common to Shin Hanga prints. And so it just happens to not really appear in any of the prints that are in the exhibition. And so I thought it would be a wonderful complement to the prints in the exhibition. So what are new Shin Hanga, or literally new prints? It's a style that flourished in the start. Well, it began in the 1910s and was kind of shepherded by a visionary publisher named Watanabe Shozaburo, who wanted to revive the aforementioned traditional printmaking technique, which had kind of diminished as time went on in the Meiji period. I should say the Meiji period, which followed the Edo period and was at its it was towards the tail end when Shin Hanga first was introduced, ended in 1912, was a time of great cultural upheaval and modernization in Japan. And so one would see rail cars and Western style infrastructure, and there was great militarization. And so amid all these changes, these prints were a bit of a nostalgic window into the past. For this reason, they were greatly appealing to Western audiences, which I'll talk about in a little while. So audiences like Bancroft. They largely draw from ukiyo-e subjects, and they have high technical quality to them, which I will also discuss in a moment. I picked this particular print to kind of be the emblem of the show when first introducing it, this Shosun print, because Shosun actually knew Ernest Fenollosa, who was a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts at the time, who was teaching in Japan, and he really encouraged Shosun to hone his bird and flower pictures, his kacho-e, in order to appeal to audiences back in the United States. And so Watanabe Shozaburo had a very similar idea around that, and that was part of his marketing technique. So one of the distinguishing features about Shin Hanga that distinguishes it from earlier ukiyo-e and earlier printmaking genres was its naturalism. You can see that there's diffuse light, there's atmospheric perspective, there's a proportional reality that really draws you in and makes you almost look like you're looking at a watercolor. And so this is achieved through a couple of different ways. They do use the traditional woodblock printmaking technique, as I mentioned, but these artists, many of whom were actually trained in Western styles as well, watercolor and oil painting, achieved this particular look through bokashi ink gradation. So having a gradation from more intense color to less on very small elements of the print in order to create natural contours and gradients on the forms in the print. And also a technique called baran suji, which is the circular motion when created when pressing a piece of paper to a woodblock. And so usually that kind of thing is hidden, but Shin Hanga printmakers were embracing it in order to create the said atmospheric effects. So if you do come to the Worcester Art Museum, prints like this, it's a little bit hard to reflect through the screen, but prints like this, you can see that the transition point in between the blue to the yellow, that there's a subtle circular motion and a much less saturated color in order to create the impression of natural gradient. And some of them also enhance their naturalism through elements like this, such as the added pigments. You can imagine that the snow was carved out of the blocks in order to create that speckled effect, but also to enhance the kind of organic movement of the snow. This artist also flicked white pigment on using his brush in order to create slightly more chaotic distribution of the snowflakes. They also have blind printing, which is when you press a slightly you press an uninked wood block to a slightly damp piece of paper in order to create an impression on the paper. And so these are almost sculptural in how detailed they can get, and they really just the technical heights that they reach is really impressive, and hopefully you can all come in person and see that. So a lot of that context is hard to explain to the average viewer. It presupposes knowledge of ukiyo-e. It also presupposes knowledge of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and the other artistic movements that may have informed the artist's decided approach to a subject. So I decided, in order to demonstrate this in the most concise way possible, to group these two on the right. The one on the left, it's the one in the little green square, is actually a tip-in image, so it's featured in the wall text label. It's not the print is not actually on view. But I think that grouping these three together when they have very similar compositional elements, included the seascape, the yellow sky, the blue water, the gradients that are very intense at some points, demonstrates in a kind of a easily digestible way the way that prints moved from the more flattened and graphic style towards the more watercolor-like effects that made Shin Hanga so distinctive as a style. So these are in chronological order. So you would have the Hiroshige, and then there's a very similar composition with Charles William Bartlett's print up on the upper right, and then you come to the Kawase Hasui print right below it. And so this also accomplishes the other another thing, which is that it introduces that non-Western artists were participating in this movement. In the case of European and American artists were participating in this movement. Charles William Bartlett had come to Japan to study ukiyo-e and Japanese printmaking in general, and then had met Watanabe Shozaburo and become a close collaborator with him. So Watanabe was recruiting talent from different parts of the world to create a more cohesive vision for what he would like to achieve with Shin Hanga. So this is what it looks like, but also I wanted to show this because you can see on the edge of the wall that there's a slightly, on the shorter edge, there's a slightly lighter green color. And so that's also drawn from that early Hasui print of Benton Pond. It also, I just thought, would be a fun play on the idea of reflections of a changing Japan. So yeah. So I didn't want to have the audience members, though, come away with the idea that it was exclusively a nostalgic revival of Japanese printmaking. This artist in particular, Yamamura Koka, was a this artist, Yamamura Koka, worked with photography in order to create his final designs. So this big head portrait, as it's called, the mica background with the bust composition was very common in ukiyo-e. And it would have, those kind of portraits or actor prints in general in the Edo period would have been handed out as a keepsake after kabuki performances. However, in the Meiji period, because of this like Western presence and the modernization, there were other easily reproducible media that was circulating in Japan at the time that served a similar function. And so then artists like this actually decided to work with that new development. And he took his own photographs of the actors in order to enhance the naturalism of the pieces. You can see between these two that the actor is wearing similar garb, and he has the same hairstyle. So it definitely could have been used as a reference. It also resulted in slightly in reduced runs. So this is one of 150, I believe. So it's quite a limited edition print, whereas ukiyo-e used to be editions of the in the thousands. And so there's a real transformation of what printmaking actually means in the context of Japanese consumerism at the time. Similarly, new subjects were introduced to ukiyo-e, to Shin Hanga as well. So new fashions and entertainments, international landscapes as artists started traveling abroad on government scholarships, and flora and fauna non-native to Japan. So this print in particular is Dancing at the New Carlton in Shanghai, shows a jazz club, which was patronized by quite a few Russian immigrants in the 1920s, but it was Shanghai's first jazz club. And you can see that there's a very decisive break from earlier Shinhanga styles. Although you do see that distinctive baransuji, there's also a sprinkling of mica if you were to see it in person. And also these women are not kind of kimono-clad beauties as one might expect, but they're very much modern flapper type figures. Also in this print, you can see that there's a decisive influence of Art Deco. So that rectilinear 1920s type style in the print itself. So prints like this I included in a group in order to demonstrate that not only were artists being trained abroad, were they consuming foreign media and artistic and different art styles, but also they were very much reflecting a changing Japan at the same time. So the movement developed with those changes. And I love these ones. I had the goal to bring attention to Shin Hanga as a topic and as a genre within the context of our programming. But I have to, if I were to give one print credit for sparking my interest in this subject, it would be the salmon-crested cockatoo by Yoshida Hiroshi. He's just so lively in person. He also it's hard to see, but he has the baransuji on the back, those circular marks, and his feathers are quite defined by the blind printing and give him a very naturalistic dimensionality, but he's very charming. It also just got me interested in these new subjects as well, because even though salmon-crested cockatoos and tigers were both depicted quite frequently in Japanese art, they weren't endemic to Japan. They're often based on either imported animals or imported art by primarily Chinese artists. I believe there's a salmon-crested cockatoo painting by Ito Jakuchu on view at the MFA in Boston right now. But this is an example also of foreign subjects being kind of introduced in a more subtle way, in the sense that they are still Shinhanga style, but they are a reflection of the world they were created in. So the next step in the exhibition that I wanted to draw attention to, and I thought that our visitors in particular would think that it was quite interesting, are the circuit exhibitions. As WAM participated in these circuit exhibitions and did host artists at the time. And so they were primarily in the 1920s and 30s in the United States, and they were organized by publishers like Watanabe in collaboration with American organizations like Japan Society in order to promote Shin Hanga as a refined, collectible type of Japanese art, as well as to appeal to the base of ukiyo-e buyers in Japan at the time, because there were still quite a few. The most famous exhibition to be put on in this context was at the Toledo Art Museum in 1930. One of the reasons that it was so famous is because of the very extensive catalog that they had published, which actually pictured the artworks and showed it more holistically as a movement. But also because it was right after the recession of 1929 started. These offered a affordable art form for middle class consumers to be able to buy and still participate in contemporary art movements. So 2 out of 3 of these are actually loans from the aforementioned collector. Moraine Lake in Chicago, in Canada, excuse me, is from the Worcester Art Museum collection. But the Grand Canyon and then Fatehpur Sikri, all 3 of these are by Yoshida Hiroshi, who is one of the most prolific travelers of the Shin Hanga artists. They're quite stunning in person in terms of the technical quality of all of them, the atmospheric light, the details on the rock structures, that kind of haziness that one sees around mountains, or if you've been to the Grand Canyon, it's very recognizable. He just captures the spirit as well as the vision of what he was looking at. And so these 3 represent collectively the presence, the impact of circuit exhibitions on Shin Hanga style. These are not in the exhibition though, and I like to show these to people when presenting about this, because it's hard to have 3 of them show the scope of these artists' travels and their presence internationally, the wide-reaching presence. And so this is from his Yoshida Hiroshi's United States series. And so you can see that there's Niagara Falls, New York Bridge, Mount Rainier, El Capitan. And then these are some of his international works from other exhibitions, tourings, educational opportunities, etc. And so, there's the Sphinx, there's Venice, Athens, Taj Mahal, the Hawaiian Islands, which was a site where many Shin Hanga artists visited quite often, possibly in part because Charles William Bartlett settled there, rural China. And so when you see them all collectively, you get a sense of how omnipresent these artworks were, and it makes you just wonder how they aren't in the common discussion of Japanese prints more frequently. So the interactions with foreign collectors also did transform the artworks themselves. This is actually also not at in the exhibition, but I just learned about this and I think it's really fascinating. So the one on the left is from the Schulten Gallery in New York, and the one on the right is from the Toledo Museum of Art. And so the one on the right, the one on the left, you can see is much more desaturated in its colors. It's got a pastel, very like almost a romanticism about it. Whereas the one on the right is very bright and intense by comparison. And so the one on the right is actually designed for American audiences. So it just shows the way that different tastes among different collectors and from different parts of the world were informing the movement and its development. So the show ends on the topic of the new directions that artists took. There wasn't really a definitive ending point for this genre of print. For the most part, there was an uptick in interest after World War II because of the American soldiers that were stationed there. as they would send them home to their families. And so there was kind of a renaissance in the sense of there were many reprints of older designs, a handful of newer designs, but that kind of petered out slowly. And it also ultimately impacted the legacy of Shin Hanga in the sense that it was no longer as much of a rarity and a refined version of ukiyo-e. Now it was a widely available, easily purchased type of artwork. But the other thing that had Shin Hanga, the initiated Shin Hanga's decline, was the international taste shifting, and because many younger Shin Hanga artists started to become interested in Sosaku Hanga aesthetics. So I'd like to use this one as an example because Kasamatsu Shiro's composition and subject matter is very harkens back to Shin Hanga and the nostalgic subjects of ukiyo-e. Snowy Village, one might find that in a Hiroshige print, for example. You also see the Barin Suji marks to add a little bit of that fluffiness to the snow. But ultimately, the style is decidedly much more abstract, and it's minimalist, and it really shows the effect of expressionism and other movements of the 1950s and 60s that influenced the artists. Another reason to end on this note too is because Yoshida Hiroshi actually came to the Worcester Art Museum in 1954, and actually again in 1957. He was invited by the curator at the time, Alice Munt, who bought some of his prints in New York City and thought it would be great to invite him to the Worcester Art Museum. Anecdotally, any of you who have been to Massachusetts, he accidentally bought a ticket to Brewster. So he was in the wrong direction. It was a bit of a hassle to get there, but he did end up doing a demonstration for our leadership team at the time. But the prints that he was selling during his exhibition, traveling exhibition, reflects this dichotomy in the shifting taste and the shift of younger Shin Hanga artists towards more abstract forms of expression. So he has the tiger's head, which is very much in the traditional Shin Hanga style, as well as this, it's called number 7. So this abstracted figural, very simple design as well. So the fact that he has that simple design though on the front of the catalog for that exhibition, I think shows the direction that he was hoping to move in at the time. And this was by ending on this note, this invites the information about the Worcester Art Museum collection and how it jump-started the collecting of Shin Hanga and contemporary prints in the 20th century. So this is just kind of an interesting thing to show together. So Yoshida Toshi came to give his lecture, but 50 years prior, his father had actually been at the Worcester Art Museum. He and his wife Fujio were displaying 75 watercolors each. And so Worcester Art Museum definitely has a legacy with this particular family of printmakers. And as for sort of the goals to continue on the conversation, the goals of the exhibition and sort of where it plays into what I'm hoping to do with the collection, we are acquiring 2 more prints by Shin Hanga artists. So one is Elizabeth Keith, who we don't have represented in the collection anymore. We don't have represented in the collection yet. And another Charles William Bartlett showing this village temple in Kashmir. So Elizabeth Keith is this Buddhist priest print. It represents a particular opportunity to also enhance our collection of female Japanese artists, because out of the 4,000 odd prints that we have, very few of them are by women artists. And so I'm very excited to have a Shin Hanga artist that is by a woman. And then Charles William Bartlett, because of the international connections of Shin Hanga and sort of what the conversations we were able to start about how much of a presence it had in different parts of the world. We were hoping to show this alongside of our newly renovated South Asian galleries, which are renovated for the first time in about 40 years, I think, 30, 40 years. And so to showcase a Japanese artwork alongside that, to show the interconnected and complex dialogue between cultures is a real opportunity. So I would be remiss if I did not if I didn't talk about any other programming or opportunities at the Worcester Art Museum. So on May 18th, I have organized a lecture, the Haley Memorial Lecture, with renowned Shin Hanga scholar Kendall Brown. I would definitely recommend any of his books if you have any more questions on Shin Hanga after this talk. As well as Alice Sung, who is a professor of art history at Boston University. She focuses mostly on Meiji era development, particularly of museums and museum collections. And so as I was developing this exhibition and learning more about the Worcester Art Museum's history of hosting artists in these circuit exhibitions, I thought it would be really interesting to zero in on the presence of Japanese artists in New England as a topic. So it'll focus primarily on the exhibition spaces that hosted these artists and the availability of for the those who collected them, the audiences for these exhibitions, and how it shaped not only the collections themselves and really initiated interest in contemporary working Japanese printmakers, but also how it shaped the careers of Japanese artists. So I think that between their expertise, that they'll have a really wonderful dialogue together. And also, as mentioned earlier, I have been working on a catalog of Japanese prints at the Worcester Art Museum. And so I worked on this in collaboration or in conjunction with Shin Hanga. It's not an exhibition catalog, but it would be the first catalog that we've had at the Worcester Art Museum that showcases highlights of the Japanese woodblock printmaking collection from the inception of the Edo period in 1603 through the modern period. So there are quite a few prints. There are 75 prints in total in the catalog. And as you can see, the front cover is Yoshida Toshi's work, who is the one who came and visited WAM on multiple occasions and really initiated that interest in Shin Hanga and more abstract contemporary prints at the time. So it also has essays by Quintana Scherer, who's a professor at Kanagawa University in Japan, and Sarah Thompson, who is curator of Japanese art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so it has a little bit more information about the collection itself. And if you're interested in John Chandler Bancroft, I actually also have an Orientations magazine article out, which I published in April 2024. So thank you so much for hearing about that. I also just wanted to throw in this one. This is also on loan, and this is has been one of our most popular prints of the exhibition. It's also quite large, but it's another one of the charming ones by Yoshida Toshi. So yes, I would love to hear any questions you may have.
Fiona, thank you so much. It's a treat for JASA to hear from a young curator and from an institution that a lot of us don't know anything about. I was shocked to learn that the first collection Japanese prints in the country. And we do have a few questions. First of all, were all the prints published, the Shin Hanga ones that you're exhibiting, by Watanabe Shozaburo?
They were not. So when Shin Hanga started becoming more popular, there were other publishers that started to work in that style. Also, as styles diversified and the demand for Shin Hanga diversified, artists started self-publishing as well and setting up their own workshops. Yoshida Hiroshi, in particular, famously set up his own workshops. And after a certain point, you can look for a seal on the side of his prints that says it's a Jisori seal, so it means self-printed. So that distinguishes that.
How have audiences in Worcester responded to the show?
They're very excited by it. Our visitors are actually quite well versed in ukiyo-e at this point because of the extensive programming that we've had, and we recently had the Floating World exhibition. So they're very intrigued to know more about what came after that, particularly because Shin Hanga is, as they're discovering, is actually lumped in with ukiyo-e quite often. If you were to type in Japanese prints into Google Images, about 30% of them would probably be Shin Hanga. And so I think they're excited to expand their canon, so to speak, of the genre.
Right. Well, I think that even after Alice Munt, both Betty Swinton and Louise Virgin, tried to do a lot with the Japanese prints in the collection.
Yes, and they also expanded quite a bit the painting collection, and Vivian Lee as well. She collected quite a few contemporary prints, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, Louise is in particular. She in the 2000s, her work with contemporary prints and also expanding the size and the monumentality of the prints. We were very lucky to have her expertise to expand the collection.
We've had a question from an eminent Shin Hanga collector who wondered if you could speak a little bit about the recent increase in auction prices for artists like Yoshida and especially Hasui.
So I think it's a lot of times artists go up in price depending on how much exposure there is to their oeuvre. So like for a long time, that exhibition catalog of the Toledo exhibition of Shin Hanga in 1930 was really one of the leading and only English language reference materials on the subject. And then there's been, as we've distanced ourselves from the end of Shin Hanga and we kind of can recognize their quality and themes and importance in that time period. So the scholarship has also increased. Also, in Japan in particular, there have been quite a few recent exhibitions on Hasui. And in the US, there have been quite a few exhibitions in the last 15 years on the Yoshida family. And so as that exposure increases either through scholarship or display, so increases the price, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you see people, interested in making sure that their collections go to Worcester now that there's this increased interest in, I don't know, expanding the Japanese collection?
I've definitely gotten inquiries about this, and part of the reason for this is because Shin Hanga was so affordable, especially 50 years ago, that people would go and collect, and they were just drawn to the heart of the beauty of them. And now that they are becoming of art, an object of art historical interest, they're interested in whether or not repositories could would be interested in collecting them. And so, yes, if anyone has any inquiries about that, please feel free to send them my way because our Shin Hanga collection is small but mighty in the sense that I think we have a couple dozen, as I mentioned.
Well, I know that, as I said, I always remember Worcester acquiring the Yoshitoshi flute player triptych. That was, and the painting too, right? You have.
Yes. So that is the flute player triptych is what I included in as kind of a singular moment in the collecting history at the Worcester Art Museum. But the original painting, the one it was based on, went for auction and we collected it, and we were very fortunate to get it in 2011. And so seeing them side by side and the dialogue between painting and print is just a very, we're very fortunate.
I have a feeling too that maybe the exhibition is popular with people because Shin Hanga is it's an interesting time in Japanese art history. As you said, it's old enough to be part of Japanese art history. I mean, they always say all art was once contemporary, and certainly Shin Hanga reflected its time at that time, but that's now, 100 years ago. So it's
Yeah.
nice, I think, for audiences to discover it and to see how it fits in the time frame between ukiyo-e and Sosaku Hanga.
Yeah, and I think also there's what distinguishes it from ukiyo-e, the features that distinguish it is becoming more it's more readily talked about. And so I think rather than thinking of it as almost an extension or like vestigial organ of ukiyo-e, it's now recognized as its own creative pursuit.
Now, we have another question. Would you consider Russo-Japanese and Sino-Japanese war prints to be part of Shin Hanga?
I would not, in the sense that they actually predate Watanabe Shozaburo's original vision for what the movement would be in the 1910s. But also Shin Hanga is the nostalgic subject matter and the particular distinctive style is kind of what brackets it. Although, granted, because they started self-publishing and they started exploring different styles, that does expand as time goes on. I would say, though, that the printmakers of Shin Hanga were not bound to the movement in the sense. Some of them collaborated with Watanabe or other Shin Hanga style publishers for a time and then went back to different styles. So it's possible a Shin Hanga artist produced it, but wasn't doing it with the intention of being a Shin Hanga print.
And that's actually a big question because there have been so many discussions about when actually, the actual beginning date of Shin Hanga. I don't know if you can speak to that briefly.
I think the official date that's usually given is around 1916, but the seeds of what planted in order to generate the movement were probably before that. Like most art movements, there are some artists or artworks that kind of toe the line where you can see that they were experimenting with making a cohesive style. And so the time of the movement beginning is often attributed to when the movement becomes cohesive in its execution. So I think there's a little bit of wiggle room there. 1910 to 1915 is probably a solid it's probably a solid date range.
So sort of coinciding with the end of Meiji, beginning of Taisho, right?
Yes, I think so.
Errol Carl wants to know how you categorize no prints by Kogyo and others.
Sorry?
How do you categorize no, the prints by Kogyo, no prints? Would you put those in Shin Hanga or not?
I'm just refreshing the visuals. It helps to have Kogyo. If I remember correctly, yeah, so I actually had considered adding those prints. He wasn't directly involved. I think there's room for a dialogue around maybe who wasn't directly involved in the core group of Shin Hanga creators, but still informed the trajectory of their style. For example, there's a Hashiguchi Goyo paired with a Alphonse Mucha print in the exhibition to demonstrate the dialogue between Art Nouveau and Goyo's work. Well, not unfortunately, but I had just applied for the grant from Japan Foundation and then Carpenter Foundation for a particular gallery. So unfortunately, it became a spacing issue. But I definitely think that if you were to explore Shin Hanga catalogs, they often include ukiyo-e, the no prints that you're referencing. Even I think I've seen Kamisaka Seka in there as well. And so just to flesh out the world that generated the style and the contextualize the training that these artists had that might have informed their designs.
Right. I think because Kogyo, one person's mentioning that since Tsukioka Kogyo started before 1916, couldn't that artist also be categorized in Shin Hanga, but I think you're probably, you've made this exhibition about a particular movement, a particular type of prints, right?
Yeah. So I think it was definitely my original checklist for the exhibition, I think, was 50 prints long, and it allowed for some of the conversations around what could have been what towed the line. But I ultimately decided to include the Sosaku Hanga, the creative prints movement that towed the line between Shin Hanga and Sosaku Hanga, to initiate conversation about the museum itself, and like looking forward to how it helped us develop into the collection it is today. Yeah, maybe one day that would be a very cool project to expand and to show the more collective vision of what might have created that.
Professor Smith wants to know which other publishers, in addition to Watanabe Shozaburo, are featured in the exhibition.
Oh, it's Daikokuya, I think, is the main other one. And then self-published prints are the other. Yoshida Hiroshi is his own studio, and then also his son's work is featured. That was printed by his father. And so I think that would be, and then Hashiguchi Goyo, one of his self-printed works as well. The majority of them were published by Watanabe Shozaburo.
Did you include any of the foreign printmakers, people like Helen Hyde or Bertha Lum?
No, so this is actually one of the opportunities, is by bringing attention to it, by bringing attention to the movement and showing it as like a valuable part of our collection. I was hoping to initiate more interest in it. So we are starting to collect in order to enhance the collection. So those two prints that I had mentioned, we're acquiring those. We're also working on acquiring a couple of prints by Paul Binney, who is a Western artist who studied in the Shin Hanga style. And so, yeah, there's definitely room for growth on that front. Charles William Bartlett carries the torch for that group, which is one of the reasons I wanted him front and center, is because there were so many contributions from non-Japanese artists. But unfortunately, it's the limitations of the collection. We did have a Bertha Lum, but she was kind of just slightly a little bit removed from it, that I think it got replaced by a different artwork.
Is there a checklist of works in the exhibition? Can we go on the museum's website, and is everything that's exhibited listed, or?
I don't think the checklist is on the website, but I'd be happy to provide it to JASA in order to distribute if you'd be interested.
One of our members is asking if there are any Yamamoto Kanai or Tobari Kogan.
No. So there are 35 prints total. The strength in our collection is primarily Yoshida Hiroshi, Kawase Hasui. And then we also got quite a large donation of Yoshida Toshi prints as well. We also have Ito Shinsui, Ohara Kosan, Hashiguchi Goyo, Yamamoto Koka. I think I might be missing a couple, but it's, yeah.
And are they all prints, or are there any preparatory drawings, or?
We do have a couple of prints that are not the finished product. So example, one of them is Ito Shinsui. There's a print that is a test print. So there's a seal on the back that shows that the process of adapting a master watercolor painting to print. So if you see other prints like that in other collections, or with the same design, I should say, in other collections, other impressions, she doesn't have as much blush on her cheeks, or she has kind of like a red on the center of her palm. Some of the textile, there's like a bit more of an impression in the textiles, and so of her kimono. And so, yeah, I incorporated that one to demonstrate the process and also connect it back to their training, how the training in different styles and exposure to Western media informed their process. So in that case, it I was trying to demonstrate that they deviated from the ink sketch that they would hand the block cutter in order to start initiating that process to a fully fleshed out watercolor, which does inform the final look of the print as watercolor-esque. So
And
that's
that brings me to another question that we just received. Why aren't carvers and printers given more attention?
So some of it is because the information is lost in some cases. Some of it is because of depending on the date and process of the printmaker, they might have done more of that themselves and been working by themselves. Some of it is error in the sense that, like, when they were doing these circuit exhibitions, there were some clerical errors. It has been a very challenging thing to look through newspapers using keywords because, for example, in the go back to my. For example, in this watercolor exhibition, Fujio is called Fuji, probably because the audiences were primed by Mount Fuji. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Yeah, so she's called Fuji there. So part of it is that as well. And then also cataloging priorities of Gilded Age collectors. They were mostly interested in the idea of a primary artist. So it depends on the context, but I think it really, it's a variety of factors.
Right, and I think that this is a problem that it goes across the board for all types of prints. I mean, it's very, very rare that any printers and carvers are ever given enough attention, even today with, contemporary prints. I'm thinking about Western prints where it's infrequent that the master printers are given their due.
Yeah, I think keeping that in mind too, so there's the projection of that onto ukiyo-e, but also a lot of our information about block cutters and things like that, and publishers and things like that, come from seals on ukiyo-e, like the identifying information and names and signatures on ukiyo-e. But that also was initiated during censorship, which was only one part of the Edo period. Prior to that, the information wasn't as readily available too. And so because artworks like ukiyo-e were considered almost like the way to my students I say, like, baseball cards or pinups or magazine cutouts, it wasn't really a prioritized information just because it wasn't considered like a higher art form.
Right. Well, Fiona, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Sure,
thank
we
you.
will be getting lots of questions and queries from people, and hopefully you'll see a lot of people on May 18th for your the Haley lecture featuring Ken Brown and Alice Tsung. And all of you, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will be on May 20th at 5 p.m. John T. Carpenter, the Mary Griggs Burke Curator of Japanese Art at the Metropolitan Museum, will be our guest speaker on the topic of calligraphy and content of the Mary Jeannie Cole's collection. The exhibition, The Three Perfections, is on view at the Met until August 3rd. And this talk is going to be focusing on his new publication, co-authored with Tim Jung, who is a research associate at the Met. In addition, in preparation for the following webinar, this webinar on May 20th, you may wish to read the interview with Jeannie Coles, which was published in Impressions 41 in 2020. Thank you all so much, and see you next month. Thank you very much, Fiona. Good night.